The OTA update looks like it finally put Hela into her place, and both our new card releases this week are putting up some solid metrics in some new deck ideas. Let's go ahead and dive it into our best decks roundup for Marvel Snap. We're going to kick off our high potential category this week with a Misery deck list. For those that haven't watched my roundups before, these high potential deck lists have impressive metrics on Untapped so far, albeit in smaller sample sizes. They could be the next breakout thing, or they could potentially fall a little bit flat as that sample size grows to statistically significant. I like a lot of what this first deck list is doing, though. It's got two very powerful plans centered around the Dirty 30 combo, as I like to call it. The basic idea is if we pass with 6 energy on the 5th turn of the game, it makes She-Hulk completely free while also unlocking the Infinite inside of our hand so we can deploy 30 points of power on turn 6. This deck list has two different ways to accomplish gaining this extra energy. The first is with Hope Summers. We play a card to her on turn 4 to have at least one extra on 5, or Electro, who normally would be very restrictive in what we can do with his extra energy, but thanks to our latest card release in Misery, we can not only get rid of the Electro after we play him, but we can also trigger his on-reveal effect again, getting even more power. War Machine acts as a little redundancy in this deck as well, giving us another way to sidestep Electro's ongoing when he stays in play, while also giving us another means to get Infinite into play in the event that we did need to play something out on turn 5. This deck list also has a small Viper sub-package that works very well with Misery. You can donate the Hood or Electro across the board to your opponent to effectively old Sandman them, and Misery can clear Hood's body while also giving you a demon. Because we're leveraging War Machine as well, we get to play Ebony Maw as another high power source for just 1 energy since War Machine gets around his downside, and then Madam Web gives us an additional mean to sidestep Ebony Maw's typical drawback should we need to play it out early but then add points later with War Machine nowhere to be found. As far as higher series cards go in this deck list, I think Hope Summers as well as War Machine are definitely the non-negotiable ones. They're really important for this deck's consistency. I would say Misery is probably replaceable with another card that can clear your Electro Body, something like Circe or Lady Deathstrike or Blink. Madam Web could be replaced by Jeff the Baby Land Shark, or another high quality 2-drop, and Eliath is just a 6-drop bomb to provide some redundancy with Infinite that could easily be something like Magneto or Red Hulk. Our second high potential deck list this week is a Misery Darkhawk variation with a phenomenally fun twist in the Phoenix Force. So Phoenix Force, historically speaking, has only been used as a card to combo with things like Multiple Man and Human Torch, and here we see it being used in a much more honest fashion. An ideal curve would be Black Widow or Rock Slide on turn 3, Misery, copy their effect and destroy them on turn 4, and then Phoenix Force, bring them back and get their effect for a 3rd time on turn 5, which with Black Widow would mean you're effectively cutting off half your opponent's draws over the course of the game. This deck list also has a variety of good and disruptive 1 energy cards that can be quite proactive at breaking up your opponent's game plan in Spider-Ham, Iceman, and Korg that are all phenomenal to copy with Misery as well. And then we mix in a little bit of Grandmaster from our recent over-the-air update to let us do all of these things again and again. As far as higher series cards go, I would actually say Darkhawk and probably Cassandra Nova are the only ones that are completely non-negotiable, as they provide good stat lines to pair with this deck's disruption. I would wager that Misery could probably even substitute for something like Absorbing Man. However, you'd obviously have to give up the adorable Phoenix Force interaction if you do that. Similar, Grandmaster can substitute for another card that lets you double up your on-reveal effects as well. Nico Minaru and Ham are definitely the best 1-drops for that slot, but they could probably also be substituted for something like Silver Sable or another cheap or 1 or 2 energy disruptive card that you enjoy. Moving along to our top performing category this week, an Agent Venom bounce variation has been topping the charts on Untapped both before and after our most recent over-the-air update. These bounce decks have always had fairly low power cards to start, with the only one that actually gets a downgrade from Agent Venom being Beast, who's still quality and important even when he gets knocked down to 4. But don't you dare touch him, Glenn, that's only in this deck. As far as substitutions go, this deck list is riddled with higher series cards. I would probably say Hitmonkey's probably the most important non-negotiable one in any bounce shell, but the rest of them you could replace with other things that provide reasonable stats that also get buffed by Agent Venom should they be missing in your collection. Our next top performer is also one of the most popular decks in Untapped metrics right now. It is an Agent Venom powered Iron Man Claw Athena Kitty amalgamation. This deck list has a variety of ways to put really efficient stats into play that can get absolutely massive in single lanes on the back of Iron Man, while also having some key disruptive elements thanks to Cosmo being really well positioned in the format. This deck list is especially difficult to play against for people looking to leverage their on reveals because in addition to playing Cosmo in one path, you can often mystique it into a second, locking your opponent's on reveal motions to just a single path in the game. This deck list output range is incredibly difficult to predict between Bast and Agent Venom and the double ups that Iron Man and Mystique Iron Man are able to provide. As far as higher series cards go in this deck, I do think Agent Venom is pretty important for the power output that it's looking to get, and then Kitty and Athena Pride are pretty unique in how they allow the deck to scale up as well. Speed could probably be replaced by something like Sage or a tech card like Rogue or Red Guardian, but it is worth noting the metrics on Untapped for people replacing Speed specifically tend to be a little bit middling, so it might be worth pursuing a different deck if he's missing in your collection. Our last top performer that also is fairly popular according to Untapped metrics is this Storm Legion Lockout deck featuring a movement package at the lower end of its curve. The Lockout, for those who aren't familiar, is you storm a location, you play War Machine so you can still play into that location and everywhere else. You then Legion that flooded, locking your opponent out of making plays on the last turn of the game while you still have free reign thanks to War Machine's ongoing effect. The movement part of this deck gives you a little bit of redundancy when War Machine's nowhere to be found. You can set up something like Dagger and Vulture on Madam Web, and then you can Storm on 4 and Legion on 5, which doesn't allow you to directly play cards on 6, but allows you to shuffle your power in a way that's most optimal for you when your opponent is likely not making any plays. As far as higher series cards go, I think Goliath is unfortunately the only one that reasonably substitutes in this deck. You could play like a Magneto or a Red Hulk as another big 6-drop bomb. Everything else, Legion, War Machine, and Madam Web are serving pretty unique roles that other cards just can't make up for if they're missing in your collection. Our third most popular deck post-OTA according to Untapped metrics is actually movement variations. While these archetypes don't have the performance metrics to be a top performer, they're definitely reasonable and competitive, with Madam Web and Anya being added to the game if you're a move enjoyer. I think it's incredibly noteworthy that this particular movement list I have on the screen is the best performing in this category, and it's not by accident that it is playing both Cosmo and Goliath. These two cards give you proactive disruption, which can break up combos of decks like Wong that can go over the top of movement, while also insulating our movement cards against opposing tech like Shang-Chi and Shadow King that would blow away the numbers that we've generated. Cosmo in particular is especially deadly on Madam Web, since you can send it around the board on the last turn of the game to stop a Shang-Chi wherever it's most likely to pop up at. Regulars will note I saved my Jeff's picks for last this week, and that's not because they're not sweet. I only enjoy playing sweet decks for the most part. It's just because they're not anything new or novel leveraging our latest card release. To be honest, I've really struggled brewing in this format. A lot of the new decks that I've been cooking up with both Agent Venom and Misery just really don't feel that competitive, so I didn't want to recommend them in this video here. That being said, these next 3 decks are incredibly sweet, and I think they are competitive in addition to being fun and unique. The first of these is this Dark Hawk Mr. Negative deck, which is one of the more consistent Mr. Negative decks I've ever played. I absolutely love that this deck is not just dead in the water when Mr. Negative is nowhere to be found. You have that proactive, disruptive game plan with the Korgs and the Cassandra Nova that you can then top off with a Dark Hawk and Mystique copying the Dark Hawk. But we also have access to those absolutely crazy Mr. Negative draws that can keep up with even Hella's best draws, putting big numbers into play. You play Negative on 3 or 4, you play Jane Foster and draw inverted Iron Man and Mystique out of your deck, and you put 30, 40, or sometimes even 50 plus points into individual lanes. You need to make some substitutions in this deck. I would say Darkhawk, Thena, and Kitty Pryde are the important core of higher series cards to let this deck have that functional backup plan when Mr. Negative's nowhere to be found, with Ravona also being necessary to accelerate Mr. Negative on occasion. Havoc, as well as Cassandra Nova, can be substituted out for other zero power cards that you can flip around with Mr. Negative, such as Sage, or even something like Wolfsbane that plays for very cheap post-inversion. My second Jeff's pick this week is a take on the Stature Odd Disruption deck that's been a mainstay in the format since Moon Knight was changed to only discard even cost cards. Specifically, I've stripped away the Darkhawk Disruptive and Stats package for both other disruptive cards like Red Guardian and Shadow King, as well as location variance mitigation in the form of Nocturne and Storm. I think Shadow King and Red Guardian in particular are really well positioned into a lot of the things that people are playing right now, and Nocturne in particular is phenomenal against the opposing Storm decks that are looking to set up combos against you, since you can slide her into that flooded location the turn that they're trying to Legion it. This deck list really felt like it had the tools to be competitive into absolutely everything, while also not giving you any completely free matchups into the metagame. Finally, would it be a Jeff's deck roundup week if I didn't share my favorite variation of Bounce in my personal picks? While the Agent Venom variations are definitely more popular, I still been enjoying this kind of classic take on Wiccan Bounce. I think it does not want Agent Venom in this particular shell. Obviously, it's explicitly bad with Wiccan, but I also think it doesn't really solve any problems that this deck actively has. Speaking of those problems, one of the challenges I was trying to figure out in this week's changes to Bounce is how we can be more competitive against the Cosmo decks that have been popping up. In particular, this sample list substitutes out Hood in favor of Spider-Ham, who can directly tag targets like Cosmo, but also works to help us keep priority going into turns 3 and 4, so that way Cosmo can't be tagging our Beast or our Falcon before they flip up. It's very possible that Hood is necessary power in this deck, and maybe I want to substitute something like Kitty for Ham, but in general, with the early games I've played with this, Hams felt very good, both for tagging Cosmo and giving you key snapping moments into other decks in the format. All in all, I feel like the direction our most recent over there update have pushed the Marvel Stat metagame in is overall favorable. I think a deck like the Agent Speed deck, being one of the better performing decks in the format, tends to keep people honest, which in turn sculpts the metagame in a more reasonable manner. That being said, in this interim point, I definitely haven't really been brewing very successfully, which has felt a little stifling for me personally. I do at least have something like Bounce to fall back on, which is a bit of my Marvel Snap comfort food. And I would love to know in the comments down below which decks you've been having fun and finding success with. As always, if you enjoyed my roundup, be sure to snap that like button and make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss my weekly roundups here and other updates on Marvel Snap game news.